Alrighty, history fans, welcome to another exciting edition of History 102, and welcome to the second of a two-part look at imperial rivalries in the 18th century. In our first lecture on this topic, we examined the Spanish, French, and English empires in the 1700s in the 18th century, and we examined how, at the end of the 7 Years' War, the English or British Empire had emerged as the most powerful. At the end of the 7 Years' War, the English colonies are ascendant. They are the dominant colonial settlements here in North America. France is defeated in the 7 Years' War. It gives up its empire. Spain is also defeated and recedes in power. And so in our first survey of these imperial rivalries in the 1700s, we noted that at the end of the 7 Years' War, by every measure, Great Britain is the dominant power here in North America. But we also ended that first part of this look at imperial rivalries in the 18th century by noting that at the end of the 7 Years' War, there would be the beginning of a divide, a cleavage between the interest of the colonists and the interest of the crown that, as I foreshadowed, would later lead to an American Revolution. In this lecture, the second of the two-part look at imperial rivalries in the 18th century, we're now going to focus exclusively on those English colonies. So no more discussion of the Spanish, no more discussion of the French. We are focusing exclusively on the English colonies because they are the dominant colonies here in North America. They are the most powerful, populous, and profitable. And so we'll focus on them in the aftermath of the 7 Years' War and examine certain cultural trends within those English colonies that will also help us understand our focus in our next lectures. Our next lecture will be dedicated to the American Revolution. We will follow the story of how a rebellion will break out among 13 colonies in opposition to the king, the crown, and from that will develop the United States as a separate sovereign nation. The second lecture, examining imperial rivalries in the 18th century, is designed to get you ready for that even more so by talking about some cultural trends in the 1700s, in the 18th century, in these English colonies that also serve to bind together the colonists in a common experience and dedication to freedom, and the ways in which that will later flower into an American Revolution. The first of the cultural trends we will examine in this lecture that serves to bind together the English colonists in a common experience and articulate ideals of freedom is consumerism. This is a product of a well-developed, vibrant trade economy that led to a period of relative affluence for most colonists in the 1700s. The 1700s, a vibrant trade economy that spans the Atlantic develops, where certain goods are produced here in North America, usually natural products or things extracted from the natural environment, timber, farming, fisheries. Also, there was a vibrant shipbuilding industry here in colonial America in the 1700s. Those goods are traded to Europe for a variety of manufactured goods, luxury goods. There's also here in the 1700s the development of a very robust slave trade, where slaves are being forcibly imported into North America. So this is known as the triangular trade or the triangle trade, where you have three continents, North America, Europe, and Africa, engaged in this field of commerce, with North America producing a variety of consumer goods, natural goods from the natural world, timber, farm goods, fisheries, building ships. Manufactured goods are being produced in Europe and being sent to Africa, being sent to North America, and slaves are being imported to develop that slave economy in the southern English colonies. So you have this vibrant trade economy, and what it does is it leads to a period of relative affluence where a lot of colonists are profiting from this triangular trade. A lot of colonists are profiting as being part of this British Empire with a now transatlantic trade system. And that meant that people across the colonies, from New England colonies like Massachusetts through mid-Atlantic colonies like Maryland and Virginia to deep south colonies like the Carolinas and Georgia, had money to spend. And they spent it through consumerism, through acts of consumerism, by buying things. And so again, in this lecture, our second look at imperial rivalries, as we now turn our focus to the English colonies, we are going to enunciate in this lecture things that urged people in the English colonies to see themselves connected as part of a common experience. And one of those forces that urged colonists to do so was consumerism. It bound them together in a common experience. They were consumers buying goods. They could buy them because they enjoyed the relative affluence and economic development that came with this vibrant trade economy. They were working in fisheries, they were cutting down forests, they were farming, they were owning slaves and cultivating tobacco, and they had things to sell. And they could take the money from the sale of those crops or ships or tobacco and buy things produced in Europe, manufactured goods. So a lot of commerce crisscrossing the Atlantic. And as a result of that vibrant trade economy and this commercial flow of goods and the affluence that came with it, even Americans, or in this case colonists, English colonists of modest means, even farmers with modest holdings, even laborers who were working for others, blacksmiths and silversmiths and coopers and cobblers, could have enough money to buy a lot of the luxury and manufactured goods produced in Europe. So it really was a common experience that spanned the geography of English America, all 13 colonies united in this common experience, and it spanned class. It spanned class distinctions. Certainly wealthy Americans, large land barons who own tobacco plantations, can afford to engage in this act of consumerism, these acts of consumerism where they're buying manufactured luxury goods produced in Europe. But even people of modest means could afford the baubles, gadgets, gizmos, consumer goods to be had in this period. So this is one of the things that binds together the colonists. They're all engaged in this British Empire of trade across the Atlantic. They're all to a relative and differing way profiting from this trade. And they got money to spend and they buy stuff. Consumerism really served as a way of binding together these colonists, but also as a way of later protesting. And in our next lecture, when we turn our attention to the American Revolution, we'll talk about the tea tax and the resulting boycott and then act of civil disobedience that helped to spark the American Revolution, the Boston Tea Party. And so that's an early indication here of how consumerism could serve as a way of expressing protest. If everyone's buying the same product, they are part of a common experience. If they object to the policies of the king, they can voice that collective outrage by not buying that product. So this is a good example of what we're stressing in this lecture, how common cultural trends bound together the colonists in a common experience, and from that foundation came a way of expressing a collective anger, antipathy that would later flower into the American Revolution. Consumerism has this ability to bind together people who might differ in other ways, people who, again, might have different incomes, different beliefs. A good example of this that we can relate to is the price of gasoline. Here in Southern California, we are such a car-dependent culture that when there is a huge spike in gas prices, it affects everyone. Now, of course, if you're a rich guy who makes $500K a year and you're driving around in a Mercedes, it's not going to hurt you as much as the guy making 30 grand and driving in an old Corolla. But because the economy is so centered on trucking and shipping, price of gas goes up, price of a lot of things go up. And maybe even if you have a Tesla and you don't use gasoline, you're still affected by the rising price of consumer goods as a result of gas prices. If you've been to a gas station when the price of gas is going up, you literally see this, where a guy in a Bentley is right across the island from a guy in a beat-up old Ford pickup. And they're both looking at each other like, damn, we're all getting screwed here, right? So we here in Southern California are car dependent. You may not own a car, but you're in some way dependent on the car-centered transportation system we have. Everything runs on gas unless it is an electric car, which are still rare despite the growing presence of Teslas on the 405 and other freeways around us. And that indicates to us how a common experience develops through consumerism. We all buy gasoline, or we buy goods that are brought to us on trucks that use gasoline. Well, in the 1700s, one of the common experiences was through the consumption of things like tea. And as we'll talk about soon, when the price of tea goes up, it motivates and galvanizes and unifies people. So consumerism was one of the things that really bound together the colonists, whether they lived in Georgia or Vermont, whether they were farmers or laborers, whether they were wealthy or poor. They're all buying things, imported things. Tea has to be imported. You cannot grow the tea plant within North America because it doesn't grow in our climate. It has to be imported from places like India and China. So you have to import it. And people were buying that import. When later people are angry at the king because he's raising taxes on the tea and limiting access to that good, well, you'll have resistance. So we haven't yet got to the American Revolution. It's coming in our next lecture, but we are likely familiar with some of the key events associated with that revolution that represent protest, acrimony towards the king, like the Boston Tea Party. The Boston Tea Party happens because tea was a commodity consumed by colonists throughout the English-American colonies. Couple that with what we've already said now about the proclamation line of 1763 after the 7 Years' War, and you're starting to see these forces that are binding together the colonists in a common experience, whether it's a common experience of consumerism or a common experience of having their land-owning aspirations threatened by the proclamation line of 1763. And again, as we are seeking to do in this lecture, you can anticipate how those forces here that are binding together the colonists in a common experience of anger, antipathy towards the king will later lead to 13 colonies united in an act of revolution, an act of collective resistance. Another force that has the same effect, what we're stressing here in this lecture, binding together the colonists and urging them to see themselves united in a way that pits them against the king, is Anglicization. And this too would serve to bind together, like consumerism, colonists throughout the 13 colonies and build a coalition among them that could later be expressed in resistance and revolution. Anglicization refers to the way in which wealthy colonists here in the 13 colonies in North America aspired to live in the same style and manner as the wealthy elite in England, the English gentry. People here in Virginia, in Pennsylvania, New York were often just as wealthy or even wealthier than the landed elite in England. We talked in our second lecture about how many in the 1600s were motivated to leave England because land was limited, land was finite, it was controlled by the landowning elite, the gentry, and they came here to North America to realize their ambitions to own land. The landed elite, the gentry in English, had established themselves as the wealthy who control the land and the markers of wealth. They lived in large manor homes. They had servants and slaves. They dressed in the latest fashions. They decorated their homes with art and sculpture. They had the bling. They had all the markers in the 18th century of being rich. Now, when colonists here who had come to America to own land fled England to realize their land-owning ambitions, when they get rich from that vibrant trade economy that we've described here, well, they want to live in that manner that marks wealth, that connotes wealth, that symbolizes wealth. So they build here in North America big Gothic homes with large porches and Dorian columns. They import their own slaves. They have their own servants. They import all kinds of luxury goods like clocks and thermometers. Believe it or not, in the 1700s, before things like, Bentleys and plasma TVs connoted wealth, like for us in the 21st century, a thermometer or a clock in one's home meant you were rich. And you can see this sometimes if you go to museums like the Getty here, where they recreate what these homes look like, the English or European homes, and many here in North America of the 1700s, where they have these really elaborate clocks, very gilded, they've got gold, they're, festooned with jewels. To us, a clock is, very prosaic, very commonplace. You could buy one at the 99-cent store. But a clock was rare, expensive, a marker of wealth. And so you'd find clocks, elaborate decorative clocks, in homes here in North America as they sought to live in this way that was just like the English. What they were saying was, we're just as rich as you are, and we want to be respected as your equal. But later, when they're not treated as equals, when they're taxed without representation, when they're subject to a variety of regulations that fail to recognize their status as wealthy landowners and elites, it will open the door to, here in the colonies, an effort by the wealthy landowning elite to lead a revolution, to see themselves disconnected from their English identity and association with the wealthy landed elite back in the mother country. Anglicization, our subject here in this slide, refers to the effort of wealthy colonists in North America to be recognized as just as rich and therefore just as worthy as the wealthy landed elite in the mother country of England. We're just as rich, if not richer than you are. We live as you do. We too have a great Gothic mansion. We too have clocks and thermometers on display. We too have a home festooned with paintings and sculptures. But as we'll soon see in our lecture on the American Revolution, when after the 7 Years' War, after 1763, the king begins to tax and regulate these colonists, when, as we've already seen, he draws a line and says, you can't have any more land. Proclamation line of 1763, the colonists here, who have up until that moment thought themselves as just as English as the wealthy elites in England, just as rich and therefore worthy of respect, when they're subject to this unequal treatment, well, it'll inspire them to sever their ties from England and lead a revolution. So again, in this second lecture, examining imperial rivalries in the 1700s, we're working to describe a number of cultural forces, first consumerism and now Anglicization, that serve to bind together the colonists. In this case, a lot of wealthy colonists are attempting to live in the manner associated with the English gentry. But we're also talking about these cultural forces that will later be key in promoting acts of resistance. When these English colonists who thought of themselves as the equals of the wealthy elite in England aren't treated as their equal, when they're taxed, when they're regulated, when they're subject to unequal status, unequal treatment, well, it'll lead them to craft a new identity as Americans and lead the American Revolution. So we've talked about consumerism. We've now talked about Anglicization. Let's talk about a third cultural factor that serves to bind together people in North Carolina, in Maryland, in Vermont, in the 13 colonies, and later urge them towards revolution. And that concerns politics. The third of our cultural factors alive in the British colonies in the 18th century is a political factor, political trend known as salutary neglect. Salutary means good, healthy. You could see it in other related terms in other languages. Salud in Spanish, right? Healthy, right? So salutary in English, built on that tradition, is the idea of something good, something healthy. Neglect, well, we all know what that means, right? How could neglect be salutary? How could neglecting something be good and healthy? Salutary neglect refers to the fact that up until really the 1760s, up until the aftermath of the French and Indian or 7 Years' War, when the king will take a much more hands-on interventionist role in the colonies were left alone. In the 1600s, the king sends indentured servants and religious dissidents over to America. He's happy to get rid of some people he doesn't want. They set up local legislatures, and really they're basically able to govern themselves because the king's all the way on the other side of the ocean. He's got his own problems in England with religious differences between Catholics and Protestants, all kinds of rivalries within the English power structure. He's got his own problems in Europe with rivalries with France and Spain. The 7 Years' War that we described in our most recent lecture isn't the first of such wars. It's sort of the last of a series of wars that stretch back to the 14th century. So the king's over here in Europe. He's over here in England. He's got all kinds of his own problems, and he basically lets the colonies govern themselves. That's salutary neglect. Salutary neglect refers to a tradition that had developed since the formation of English colonies in 1607 and continuing through the mid-1700s, where the king of England basically let the colonies govern themselves. They got their own local legislatures. The only people who could vote for those who served in these legislatures and the only people who could serve were property owners, so it's elite rule, and therefore the king doesn't worry too much about what's going on over there. And that meant over time, the colonists got used to this idea: we can do what we want. We can govern ourselves. It's salutary. It's good. It's healthy. It's positive that we're left alone. That the king is not so meddlesome, interventionist, meddling in our affairs. We've got our own local assemblies. They represent, again, the interest of the local elite. We're going to get our way, and the king won't interfere. Sometimes when the king did try to interfere, the colonies just ignored the dictates of the king and openly violated British law. That will happen with the proclamation line that we described in our most recent lecture. When the king draws a line and says, don't go west of the Appalachians, what do the colonists do? They go west of the Appalachians because they want that land. They see that land as theirs. They believe that they have a claim to that land, and they don't respect the dictates of the king. The king's on the other side of the ocean. What the hell is he going to do about it? And there's this long-standing tradition of salutary neglect where they have been used to doing whatever the hell they want. And so even when the king does try to turn the screws, does try to intervene, the colonists say, no thanks, we're going to do what we want. What are you going to do about it, right? Basically challenging the king. Though I've stressed to you in these early lectures that the only people who could serve in colonial legislatures that for so long were subject to this salutary neglect were white male property owners, and that the only people who could vote for those who served were, again, white male property owners. There were a lot of people, particularly in many colonies, who were becoming landowners because of the other trends we've stressed in these lectures: the wars of aggression against Native Americans, the population increase, the inclination of these colonial legislatures to make land available. So yes, it's absolutely true. It will remain true well after the American Revolution into the 1820s and 1830s that the only people who could vote are white male property owners. But in some colonies, up to 80% of adult males did own land, because this is a period where, as we've described in many of our recent lectures, the colonists are avidly seeking out land, land, and land. They want land. They fight Native Americans. They take their land. That's Bacon's Rebellion. That's King Philip's War. That's the events we've described previously. So we have already under our nails in our cultural understanding of this period a lot of evidence now of how there are these very aggressive efforts to displace Native Americans and seize land. And so that meant that 80%, in some cases, of the adult white male population owned some land and could vote. And that meant they participated in this political culture of solitary neglect. Again, in this lecture, we are talking about things that are commonly experienced among the 13 colonies, things that bind people together. They're all buying stuff. The wealthy are trying to stylize their existence in regards to Anglicization, and a lot of people in the colonies own land and participate in this political culture of solitary neglect, where they see themselves as able to govern themselves. And this is key. This is very important to the road to the American Revolution that we're sketching out in this lecture. Because when the king does intervene, when the king does, after 1763, draw a proclamation line, levy a stamped act, engage in a variety of efforts to, in a hands-on way, intervene in the colonies, that makes them angry because they don't like being taxed. They don't like being denied access to land. But it also runs counter to 150 years of solitary neglect. Why all of a sudden is the king bothering us? Why all of a sudden is the king intervening? We've been used to doing what we want. And when the king comes in and says, no, 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 you're going to get resistance. So solitary neglect, this political tradition of self-governance, of being left alone, of being able to govern our own affairs, of even when the king does stuff that's designed to intervene, we just ignoring that and doing whatever the hell we want anyways. Yeah, that's something that binds together in some cases 80% of all white men in a colony. But it also, again, will prove causal, consequential, and sparking resistance, because when the king does this, when the king finally does intervene and violate solitary neglect, it sparks resistance so that the colonists can once again govern themselves. Independence, self-determination. Another cultural factor that serves to bind together the colonists in the 18th century in the English colonies, and later also proves to be important, causal, consequential in sparking the American Revolution, is a print culture that develops in this period. This is unique to the British colonies. You don't really see this in the French Empire. There's just not enough French settlers to be an audience, to be a marketplace for newspapers and pamphlets and books. You don't see this in the Spanish Empire either, because again, many of the Spanish settlers who came were motivated by gold. They wanted to get rich and go back to Spain. They weren't particularly interested in staying abreast of politics and political debates. But in the English colonies, the British colonies, there were a lot of newspapers and pamphlets circulating. A lot of interest in new ideas coming out of Europe, because the colonists here were staying here. They were here for land, land, and land. They weren't going to go back to Europe. And so the only way to read about what was going on in Europe, to have access to a lot of the ideas coming out of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution of the 1600s and 1700s, was by importing books and making books available so that you could read about John Locke and his theories of political governance. You could read about the great thinkers of the Enlightenment and scientific revolution. So within English America, a lot of newspapers, a lot of pamphlets, a lot of books circulating. And particularly in northern colonies, high literacy rates. Many of the colonies in the north, like Massachusetts, were founded by religious groups like the Puritans. We talked about the Puritans extensively in our second lecture. The Puritans were dedicated to creating here God's perfect order, a city upon a hill, which meant a perfectly realized biblical society, meaning a society that lives strictly according to the Bible, strictly according to God's laws. Well, if you are going to live strictly according to the Bible, you better be able to read the Bible, better know what it says to do. And that meant that the Puritans, because they were so dedicated to living strictly, purely in line with the Bible, were almost 100% literate. And they passed that on to their sons and daughters and grandsons. And so, owing to some religious traditions that emphasize biblical literacy, you had very high literacy rates in the northern colonies. Southern colonies, not so much, not as high in terms of literacy rates, because those southern colonies weren't founded by religious groups like the Puritans and others that were really committed to biblical literacy. But even in some southern colonies, you had high literacy rates relative to other human populations around the globe. So a lot of people who can read, people who want to read, and as a result, newspapers, books, pamphlets proliferated. There were also, among the elite, efforts to create forums by which educated elite people could get together and debate some of the new challenging ideas coming out of Europe, out of the Enlightenment. Ideas of John Locke, who argued for natural rights, that all human beings had natural rights to pursue life, liberty, and property. Those new challenging ideas about human nature, the human condition, how to govern oneself, that, as we'll soon see, proved to be so consequential, influential in the American Revolution, are circulating and permeating through English America before the American Revolution, influencing and infecting through literary clubs where educated elite individuals would come together and argue and debate about these new ideas about how best to govern society, how humanity should be understood. In professional societies where educated, learned individuals would come together and debate and argue. So, in addition to a lot of books being around and a lot of ideas and a very active and engaged print culture, in addition to high literacy rates, there are these locations, these forums for people to come together and share ideas. There's no internet in the 18th century, but these work in the way in which the internet works today, where people could share information, debate and argue, and ultimately help ideas circulate. In the 1700s, those ideas circulated through literary clubs and professional societies. And there, these educated elite individuals could learn more about these new challenging ideas coming from John Locke, Baron de Montesquieu, Voltaire, the great leading figures of the Enlightenment, who are arguing for new ways of organizing human society. And it will be those very ideas, ideas of liberalism, republicanism, natural rights, that, as we'll soon see, will animate the American Revolution. So another cultural factor that helps us see the origins and beginnings of the American Revolution here in the mid-1700s, this print culture, this public culture where ideas can circulate. Who joined these literary clubs and professional societies? Well, it reads like a who's who of the American Revolution. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, James Madison. They were all members of these groups. So there's your proof that engagement with these literary clubs would later lead to a revolution. The very leaders of the revolution, people who go on to sign the Declaration of Independence, were members of these literary clubs that in the decades before the American Revolution encouraged them to be engaged with the ideals of liberty and freedom that later inspired the American Revolution. 1740s, Benjamin Franklin founded the University of Pennsylvania as the very first secular, non-religious university in English America. The very first university founded in English America was Harvard, founded in 1636. And it was founded as a religious school. It was designed to train people to be ministers. The only thing that Harvard offered in 1636 in terms of a major was God, was religious studies. Because if you went to Harvard in the 1630s, you were going there to be a minister. Following Harvard came a number of other schools that you may have heard of that are now considered the elite schools in America, Ivy League schools like Brown and King's College, which later becomes Columbia, Yale. But all of those universities also were religious schools. They were divinity schools. They were designed to teach people to be ministers. Ben Franklin was worried that there's no college or university in English America dedicated to science, dedicated to secular knowledge. And so he founded the University of Pennsylvania for that end. Now, you're probably somewhat familiar with Ben Franklin as a scientist and an inventor. He invents bifocals. He invents the Franklin stove. He does his experiments with electricity. So Ben Franklin was really interested in science, and he wanted there to be a forum, a foundation by which scientific ideas and thought can circulate through English America. We need scientists here, and so we need to train them. Ben Franklin also was very suspicious of organized religion. He believed in God, but he didn't really believe in a lot of the religious foundations in America that he often saw as manipulative. So he wanted to form a secular, non-religious university to counter Brown, Yale, Harvard, all of these other universities that were only focused on religion. He wanted to form a university that would offer people a chance to study science, study Enlightenment thinking about the human condition. So he founded the University of Pennsylvania, which itself goes on to be an Ivy League school. But it was founded not as a religious school, but as a secular school. So in addition to literary clubs, professional societies, a lot of newspapers and pamphlets, there's now, in the decades prior to the American Revolution, a university dedicated to teaching people about science and secular thought. A university here founded by Franklin that was designed to proliferate scientific studies coming out of, again, the scientific revolution, but often challenged religious thinking about the origins of human life, the origins of the universe, how the universe operates. And also, the University of Pennsylvania would teach secular ideas like those of John Locke and others that would later inspire the American Revolution. So you have this very active public sphere, print culture, literary clubs, professional society, all of these ways before the American Revolution where people can be bound together in a common experience of sharing ideas. That's the big theme, one of the big themes in this lecture, the things that bind together the colonists: consumerism, Anglicization, and an active public and political culture. But also we're stressing in this lecture that the means that bind them together would later be key in influencing revolution. Consumerism, with the way in which tea could serve as a source of boycotts and resistance. Salutary neglect, this tradition that we should be allowed to govern ourselves. And here, in this active public sphere, where ideas that would later inspire the American Revolution can freely circulate, influence, infect, and later inspire people to take up arms against the king. Here's an image of the Pennsylvania Gazette. One of the interesting elements of colonial America in English is that S's were often rendered as F's, right? So in a lot of our early documents, the president is referred to as the prefident. This has something to do with linguistics that we won't get into. But it's important to note here because as you look at the title of this particular colonial newspaper, you see the Pennsylvania Gazette, what we might call the Pennsylvania Gazette. It was just one of many daily newspapers that circulated through, in this case, the colony of Pennsylvania, but other colonies where there was a large population of literate people who did want to read. Newspapers go on to be very, very important in inspiring the American Revolution because they allowed ideas to reach not just educated elite types like Ben Franklin, but farmers and laborers who often read these newspapers. A common experience, a daily experience. When we turn our attention in our next lecture at the American Revolution, we'll talk about Common Sense, a pamphlet that's published in early 1776 that in a matter of months is printed in copies numbering over 100,000. Being able to reach not just a few educated elites, but farmers, laborers, the very men who will fill the ranks of the Revolutionary Army. So a print culture centered on newspapers, pamphlets, ideas able to circulate, infect, influence, something that's shared widely in English America, something that's unique to English America, different than the French and Spanish empires of this period. So it satisfies that first goal of this lecture, to communicate to you a number of things shared by colonists. But also, as we'll see, it would prove to inspire revolution when on the pages of these newspapers and pamphlets, revolutionary ideas will be printed, circulate, and influence. Let's conclude this lecture, conclude our look at the English colonies in the decades prior to the American Revolution with one last cultural event that, again, will bind together colonists spanning the 13 colonies, and also later proved to be consequential, influential, and inspiring revolution. That last cultural development or trend that speaks to those two issues is the First Great Awakening, a major religious revival that started here in the English colonies, 1720s, 1730s, 1740s, and later would spread like wildfire throughout the 13 colonies. So this religious revival, like consumerism, Anglicization, salutary neglect, the active and engaging print culture, is an example of an event or a trend in colonial culture that is spanning the 13 colonies, uniting these 13 colonies in a common experience. But as we have seen with consumerism, Anglicization, salutary neglect, this cultural trend spanning the colonies will also be very influential and inspiring a revolution. First Great Awakening is one of 4 moments in American history of great religious excitement and enthusiasm. There are 4 such moments in American history. The first is the, First Great Awakening, which we'll examine here. Later in the class, we'll talk about the Second Great Awakening, the sequel, which begins in the early 1800s, in the decades after the American Revolution. The third moment of great religious excitement begins in 1920 and spans that decade in the aftermath of a time of great change in the early 20th century, in the aftermath of World War I, amidst a global pandemic, Spanish flu. And then the fourth moment of great religious excitement and enthusiasm, where the whole of the nation is rocked by a great commitment to religiosity, began in the 1970s with the advent of televangelists, born-again Christianity, and the cultural conservative movement. So there are 4 moments in American history, the decades prior to the American Revolution, where the First Great Awakening sweeps through the nation, the early 19th century, when you have the Second Great Awakening, the 1920s, and then later, the late 20th century, beginning in the 1970s, where the United States, in this period, the colonial era, is marked by a period of great religious excitement and enthusiasm. First Great Awakening was rooted in the relative affluence of this period, which we've talked about in previous slides in this lecture. People were making money in the 1700s. It was a time of a vibrant trade economy. But that prosperity led to some introspection and doubt among colonists here in English America. The descendants, the great grandsons of Puritan and Pilgrim and Quaker groups that founded early English American settlements. They said, look, my grandfather came here to create a city upon a hill. My grandfather came here for religious purposes, fleeing persecution, hoping to create a new biblical-based society here in North America. But now I spend my time making money. Now I seem to be interested in materialism, consumerism, more land, more stuff. And from that introspection came a sense of betrayal, that we've betrayed our ancestors, that our ancestors came here, risked their lives to cross the Atlantic, battled Native Americans, for the greater glory of God. And now, many generations later, we don't have those religious-based societies. We have societies dedicated to making money and buying more things, consumerism, materialism, Anglicization. And from that came the First Great Awakening, where colonists who have this confrontation with the self and this awareness of the way in which they seemingly betrayed the ideals of their ancestors want to get back right with God. And so you have the First Great Awakening. You have this recommitment to Christ. You have this moment, the first of four in our history, of great religious enthusiasm motivated by this seemingly turning one's back on the ideals of God. First Great Awakening emphasized this process by which individuals must recognize their sins and failings and recommit to God. It was very much focused on individualism, an individual responsibility, and an individual's imperative to reject wealth, consumerism, mammon, and recommit to God. And that's one of many ways in which the First Great Awakening helps to set the stage for the American Revolution. This emphasis on individualism, this emphasis on individual free will, this confrontation with oneself and an urging as an individual to recommit to God. Later on, you'll see a very similar dynamic in the American Revolution, where you have to pick whose side are you on, the king or the colonists. Are you loyal to the king or loyal to the revolution? This idea of individuals having to make a choice. This idea of individuals making a stark and clear decision that later is crucial to the American Revolution decades later was here first influenced by the First Great Awakening. So again, in the totality of this lecture and now in our examination of the First Great Awakening, we're talking about things that happened before the American Revolution that span the 13 colonies and later influence that revolution. We're talking about trends that later will have consequence in helping us to explain why in the 1770s 13 colonies rise up in rebellion against the most powerful nation on earth. Well, the First Great Awakening really primed that pump because it was so centered on this idea of individual will, individual choice. During the First Great Awakening, when nobody knows there's going to be a revolution, the emphasis was on individual choice in regards to how you're going to live your life. Are you going to side with God, or are you going to dedicate your life to earthly possessions and wealth? Well, that emphasis on individual will later be important in the American Revolution, where, again, you had to pick sides. Are you on the side of the revolution or the king? So this First Great Awakening is very, again, indicative of the trends we're talking about in this lecture. Things that are commonly expressed and experienced across the 13 colonies, and things that really later become influential in the American Revolution. This emphasis on individualism, individual choice, naturalized that imperative, communicated to the colonists that this is part of life, having to make choices. As an individual, you had that free will. And that later, again, established a footing, a foundation for making a choice in regards to the revolution. The people who lived through the First Great Awakening, who lived through this convulsive religious excitement spanning the 1730s, 1740s, are the same people who lived through the American Revolution. Not all of them lived through it, but this formative experience in one's youth would later be very influential in adulthood, in one's maturation later in life during the American Revolution. The same Americans who lived through the First Great Awakening would later live through the American Revolution, and the emphasis on individual will, individual choice, at the heart of the First Great Awakening would help to indeed naturalize the idea of an individual choice in a revolution to come. Another aspect of the First Great Awakening was its emotionality. It's very indicative of a trend we see in American religious expression of expressions of religious faith that are outward, expressive, passionate. When Americans go to church, when Americans express their religiosity, they do not do so through quiet contemplation. It doesn't really have that style to it. It isn't involving, people sitting in their bedrooms staring at the Bible. People sing, they dance, they express in a very emotive way their connection with God. It's one of the many reasons why, though, as we've stressed in some of these lectures, there's a European influence in American history and American culture as we come out of European settlements. Today, America remains very different than Europe in terms of its religious adherence. Americans are much more likely to identify themselves as religious than Europeans. Americans are much more likely to attend church, synagogue, mosque regularly than Europeans. And part of that has to do with the American style of religion, where it is so infectious, so enthusiastic, where people are singing and dancing and clapping and running around the room. They don't do that in Europe. It's a very American way. And it began here with the first Great Awakening. It began here with the first moment of great religious enthusiasm. It was very passionate and emotional. And what this meant was it could spread. It could spread like wildfire. People were influenced by it. It was a very open, expressive form of Christianity. People were drawn to it. They wanted that sense of ecstasy that came with recommitting to God. And so it again inspired the masses and spread throughout English America. George Whitefield was an English minister, and in the early 1700s, Whitefield was very despondent because so many of the citizens of England had turned against religion and become increasingly secular during things like the Scientific Revolution that offered secular, non-religious answers to questions like who are we, where we came from, how we should behave, the Enlightenment with its ideals of secular government. So George Whitefield, represented here in this painting, was very despondent that his fellow English citizens were turning against God. And then he hears of these other English-speaking people on the other side of the Atlantic in the 13 colonies who, rather than embrace secularism, are becoming more religious. He hears about the First Great Awakening, how in the 1720s, 1730s, 1740s, there's all this religious enthusiasm in America. And he says, thank God that somewhere around the world, English-speaking people remain religious. And he gets on a ship, sails across the Atlantic, and he comes here to America. And he's overjoyed to see this great outflowing, this great outburst of religious enthusiasm. And he travels up and down the Atlantic coast, up and down the 13 colonies, and he taps into this energy and enthusiasm. And here he is, standing at the pulpit, speaking to the masses. So he was drawn to an already existing religious excitement, and then he helped advance it. He came to America and he gave these passionate sermons that got people whipped up into a frenzy, making George Whitefield sort of a celebrity preacher well before the radio, television, and internet age, but also creating this common collective experience that again is very analogous to the other common collective experiences we've seen in this lecture. Here, one of religious excitement, spreading like wildfire through the charisma of George Whitefield and other preachers who are traveling through these 13 colonies, inspiring religious excitement. The First Great Awakening was centered on this idea of recommitting to God, a new birth, a recommitment to God. Again, it was inspired by, it originated among the descendants of original religious founders of English America who felt they had betrayed those ancestors by becoming too interested in wealth and materialism, and they had to recommit to God. So it was really centered on this idea of being born again, well before that idea will catch on in American religiosity in the late 20th century. And that also demonstrates how the First Great Awakening crackled with certain critical sensibilities that would later go on to influence the American Revolution. Decades before the American Revolution, decades before, colonists will sign the Declaration of Independence, rise up in rebellion. They had already come to embrace this idea of breaking with the old and embracing the new, of ending older modes and embracing new modes, of the value that came from rejecting a certain way and embracing a new path. Everything I just said in the last 10 seconds, that's a revolution, right? Rejecting an old way, embracing a new one, seeing the positive consequences of ending an old order and vaulting into a new one. And that's how, though the First Great Awakening was about religion, it was about recommitting to God, would later again naturalize, establish within this generation an embrace of the new, an embrace of change, an embrace of revolution that would later flower into political revolution. The First Great Awakening was a revolution of the soul. But later on, the people who lived through it would come to embrace other revolutionary movements as good and salubrious. Change is good. Change is often necessary. And individuals have to make their choice. What side are they on? Again, prior to the American Revolution, nobody knows there's going to be a revolution. Nobody has a crystal ball. But they were living through this religious awakening that urged them to have a certain sensibility, a certain way of thinking that would later make a political revolution in the 1770s something worth supporting, something worth embracing. A lot of the trends we've described in this lecture have, again, been able to bind together colonists from different backgrounds. That's really something I've stressed and why we're dedicating a whole lecture to this, because again, it helps us anticipate a revolution to come. Consumerism, even modest people of modest means could engage in that consumer economy. High literacy rates, high political participation. But despite the fact that consumerism, Anglicization, salutary neglect, an active and engaged print culture do have the possibility of reaching a lot of white men, even of modest means, they are limited in the way in which they don't reach Native Americans, African Americans, women. This last cultural trend, this last cultural development of the First Great Awakening does incorporate and reach people that these previous trends of consumerism, Anglicization excluded, making the First Great Awakening the most all-encompassing of these experiences. First Great Awakening folded into it women, free blacks in northern colonies, even inspired many slaves by this great contagious religious excitement. Women will be vital to the American Revolution. Some women will actually fight in the American Revolution. Or they will be nurses. They will help the economy of colonial America continue while men are off fighting. African Americans fought in the Revolution. So if we're stressing here how the First Great Awakening gets people ready for a revolution by exciting critical sensibilities of individual will, embracing change, the good that comes with ending an old order and embracing a new order, well, the First Great Awakening and its ability to bring those critical sensibilities to all Americans, not just property-owning white men, helps to understand how many groups vital to the American Revolution, Native Americans, women, African Americans, will later participate in that revolution because they too were touched by the way in which the First Great Awakening excited those religious sensibilities and critical sensibilities of the American Revolution. So we end with the First Great Awakening, and we end by noting that the First Great Awakening created a way of thinking, a body of critical sensibilities and understandings that would later influence the American Revolution. Change, individual will, criticism of the existing order, criticism of the powerful, the righteousness of trusting oneself, one's individual beliefs and thoughts. If you're going to turn your back on an existing order, if you're going to reject materialism, mindless consumerism, and embrace a more religious orientation, that takes some bravery, takes some boldness, it takes bravery to challenge an existing order. First Great Awakening made people brave. It made people willing to do that in embracing God and rejecting materialism and consumerism. But to rise up in rebellion against the King of England, you also have to be brave. You also have to be bold, and you also have to be confident in your own sense of what is right. And that again is how the First Great Awakening inspired that way of thinking. It urged people to be willing to trust themselves. It urged people to commit to individual choice. It urged people to see that change is good, whether it is a religious change or a political change. And in doing so, really serve as a way to, again, prime the pump, establish a foundation for revolution. So in the second look at 1700s, our second look here at the decades prior to the American Revolution, we've looked exclusively at the English colonies, which, as we've now established, are the most powerful, populous, and profitable of these colonial settlements and societies, and the foundation of the American Revolution. And we've examined trends within those English colonies that serve to bind together colonists in a common experience: consumerism, Anglicization, solitary neglect, print culture, First Great Awakening. But we've also stressed how all of these trends not only bind people together, but they set the stage for an American Revolution. That will be our focus in our next lecture.